Hey everyone, this is the third and final lecture of World War I. It's the end of World War I, and this is going to be pretty short and sweet, I would say. I don't know, you'll tell me. Let's get into it. The end of World War I really comes about as the United States comes into World War I. Up to this point, around 1916, President Wilson had run for re-election promising the United States that they would be neutral, that he would be neutral in, quote, thought as well as deed. So they wouldn't do anything, act on anything, and stay out of it. And he was looking to develop no entangling alliances. So I don't want to get caught up in Europe's drama. But that I wouldn't say he exactly stuck by that, because the United States did have friendly relationships with many of the Allied powers, including Britain and France. And they very much saw Germany as the aggressor and were fearful of Germany for getting too strong. And so they did take steps to help the Allies throughout the war to defeat Germany. And so the United States traded supplies with them, gave them money. We call it aid when we're talking about government money to another government, and loans to the Allied power. Oh, look at those fun graphics just pop up like that. But there were two major events that changed the United States' mind. Unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. And we could go into depth, and you will in U.S. history, but we're going to just keep it real basic here. Unrestricted submarine warfare was what the Germans were doing with their U-boats, and they were trying to sink British ships that were allegedly full of war supplies. Of course, that's one way to defeat your enemies. However, they were doing so without warning, and they were sinking passenger ships, so with torpedoes. So people just traveling across the Atlantic Ocean were dying as their ships were sunk. And traditional rules of war would allow innocent passengers to get off before the ship was attacked, and the Germans were breaking that rule. And then finally in 1915, they torpedoed a boat called the Lusitania, which had U.S. citizens on it. It actually also had war supplies, which it wasn't supposed to because it was a passenger ship. The United States was outraged. Germany promises to stop sinking these passenger ships and actually stays by that promise until 1917. And then in their efforts to bring down the British, they're still in war with the British, they renewed this policy and they start sinking passenger ships again. And the hopes was to starve, really not to kill people, but to prevent supplies from reaching Britain and to starve Britain into surrendering. As an ally of Britain, this makes the United States very angry. It's also good for business for the United States to be able to ship supplies back and forth across the ocean, and so you don't jeopardize the United States business interests. And then also in 1917, in January of 1917, something called the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted by the United States. And what this telegram was it was a message from a German ambassador, foreign ambassador, to Mexico, offering to help them invade the United States and help fight to get Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to be part of Mexico. So what's interesting is essentially this one country, Germany, was offering to another country, hey, if you start a war with this third country, we'll back you up and then you get this extra land. But really they were trying to distract the United States, kind of aggravate the United States. It's possible that they never even intended Mexico to get this and for this to really happen. And it was just kind of a devious diplomatic move. I don't know if diplomatic's the right word, but somewhat of a devious move on the Germans' part. But between these two events and a few other policies and trends that you'll cover in U.S. history, the United States enters the war April 2nd, 1917. It's important that you note the date, not so much so you memorize the date, but we were pretty far into World War I by the time the United States gets into it. And when you look at this chart, that's really evident for how many men were killed in battle in World War I. You can see the Russians. We've talked before about the Russians bearing the biggest brunt of the loss. But then Germany was right behind them, and so on and so on. Now, the United States has such a small number, not because the United States was so awesome in their fighting abilities. I mean, they were good, but because they came into the war so late. These other countries had been fighting for 3 years or more. And it was only the United States servicemen that actually were sent over, as opposed to people who lived in the areas where the fighting was going on. So there's a lot of kind of hero worship, I guess, of the United States, and there's a framing that the United States really saved Europe, and they did, but not so much because we were a superpower or geniuses. It's because we came in late, we had fresh troops, we had fresh supplies, and we get a lot of credit for refreshing the Allied powers and then causing Germany to surrender. And here we are at Germany surrendering. At this point, Germany had lost their allies because Austria and Hungary were out and several other countries were out. They lost their position of strength and they lost the support of their citizens. Their citizens were sick of war. The Kaiser steps down and agrees to an armistice. So something that's a little bit different than a treaty, but it's an agreement to end fighting. So they don't necessarily have all the stipulations figured out yet for a lasting peace, but they all agree to stop. And so Armistice Day is marked on November 11th, 1918. It was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And so it was supposed to be poetic, and it is what became our current day, Veterans Day. In an effort to help make peace, President Woodrow Wilson designed a 14-point plan, and this was the United States proposal for peace, for long-lasting peace. And amongst the 14, some of the highlights were overall to make the world safe for democracy again, to have no secret alliances between countries, to encourage free trade, to reduce the amount of arms, so to reduce kind of that militarism that helped cause the war, and to create something called the League of Nations. And this was to be an organization of nations, a diplomatic organization of nations that were geared to settle their differences peacefully. So a way for countries to come together and talk out their conflicts so a war didn't happen again. So President Wilson brings his 14-point plan to the Paris Peace Conference. It was in 1919 and it was attended by the Big Four: France, Britain, Italy, and the United States. You should notice that they are the Big Four because they are the Big Four winners of the war. Germany and Russia were not included. Germany as the loser, and Russia because they had dropped out of the war early and had their own Russian Revolution. And quite frankly, the Big Four weren't that interested in having Russia there. And they worked to draft the Treaty of Versailles. A treaty, in case you don't know, sets up the terms of peace and what each country would get or would have to do. And this is just kind of a cool side fact. The Big Four met at the Palace of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. We learned about that when we learned about Louis XIV. So what were these goals in the peace treaty? Well, all four countries agreed that countries should have self-determination and decide their own government through a voting process. However, Britain, France, and Italy additionally wanted to punish Germany and keep its military weak. They blamed Germany for the war and believed by not allowing them to have a strong military that they would not be a risk in the future. The United States, on the other hand, was more focused on just developing a fair treaty and a lasting peace. But Britain, France, and Italy, having bore the brunt of the war, had a little bit of a stronger voice in the negotiation, and they developed Germany's punishment. And one of the things that Germany was to agree to is they were to accept the blame, pay reparations, so $54 billion worth of reparations for all the damage that was done. In today's money, that would be $663.9 billion for all of the damage that they had caused in the war. They were to give up pieces of land in Europe and all of their colonies, and they were to limit the size of its military and navy. This left the Germans extremely angry. And several problems developed. Without colonies, Germany couldn't provide food, fuel, and coal for its citizens. They couldn't run factories if they didn't have those things, and they couldn't make money to pay their war debt. So they continued to fall into a deeper and deeper financial crisis. Russia resented losing some of their land, so they started to become more bitter towards other parts of Europe and the United States. And as new borders were drawn, ethnic groups were forced together in new countries that they didn't want, and rivalries developed from there because they too were not represented at these peace talks. The United States never actually signed the Treaty of Versailles. That was something that while Wilson was there negotiating it, the Senate has the power to approve. And they rejected the treaty mostly as a political move against Wilson. The Senate was dominated by Republicans. Wilson was a Democrat, and they didn't want to see him succeed. So there was some political drama to that. But also the United States citizens didn't want it. They wanted to be isolationists. They wanted to go back to being neutral and not be involved in other countries' affairs. They wanted to go back to normal. Now, Wilson's 14 points were largely ignored, except there was a League of Nations created that was meant to prevent future wars. And the fact that this is World War I probably gives you a clue that it's not super effective. And Wilson kind of saw that coming. And so he warned the world of a new war in the future. And as we know, spoiler alert, he wasn't wrong.